Hello, welcome to this week's episode of the CRICKETher Weekly. We are at the Ageas Bowl, as you might be able to see, as our backdrop today, and we are back at regional cricket, Sid's beloved Vipers against the Thunder today. And we were actually meant to be watching the Vipers on Friday, but we had some sad news, and indeed the nation had some sad news. Unfortunately, Queen Elizabeth II passed away on Thursday, and therefore sporting fixtures were called off on Friday as a mark of respect. And it's obviously quite a momentous period in the history of the country. And there was a little bit of a debate, wasn't there, Sid, about whether yesterday's match, the first in the England series against India, and today's round of matches in the Rachel Hayhoe-Flint Trophy would or should go ahead, wasn't there?
Yeah, and the football authorities took the decision to call off all their matches this weekend, so football's been called off right from the Premier League right down to grassroots. Clubs have been told not to organise matches, and obviously there was a lot of debate at the ECB because they had a meeting that started at 9 o'clock in the morning, and they still hadn't reached a decision but by around 12 o'clock, and they eventually did, and they decided that they would go ahead with the matches on Saturday and then allow things to continue, and I think that's probably the right decision. We've had a moment's silence here prior to the match, and then they played the national anthem, God Save the King, and they did the same at the England match last night. Life goes on, and I kind of feel that that's possibly what the Queen herself would have wanted. She wasn't a woman that liked to fuss, and so life goes on, and we've been privileged to enjoy some cricket.
Yeah, I sometimes think that the Queen would have had a similar experience to my mum over the years, because obviously the Duke of Edinburgh was known to be a very big follower of cricket, and therefore the Queen would presumably have had to endure it being on in the background for many hours, and therefore would have incidentally picked up things about cricket like my mum has. Anyway, so let's talk a bit about the situation for regional cricket, Sid, because it feels like quite a long time ago since we watched any. It was obviously back in July when they paused the Rachel Hayhoe-Flint Trophy to make way for the Commonwealth Games, and then subsequently to that the 100. So what's the situation in terms of the points table?
The Vipers are out on top, just ahead of the Diamonds. So Vipers and Diamonds are the ones in pole position, and they look like they're almost certain to qualify for the eliminator at least, and one of them obviously will qualify directly for the final as well at Lords.
I believe in this competition it's known as a semi-final.
that I believe that's correct, yes. And then who have we got in third place? We've got the South East Stars in third place. They haven't actually had a great morning, but they're in a good position to make that final qualifying spot. But right now, as we stand, everybody could make that final qualifying spot for the semi-final. It's all to play for out there. We have, of course, had these 4 matches postponed. Now, there's a big question. Obviously, we don't know for certain whether it will be possible to actually reorganise these matches, or whether they'll ultimately be declared shared points. And we're going to have to find that out. We haven't seen anybody that we've been able to ask today, but we will try and find that out and tweet any information that we get.
So these are the ones that were postponed from Friday due to the passing of the Queen. Therefore, that meant that but because we're kind of at the back end of the season, it's difficult to know when they might find time to reschedule those.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a hard deadline, of course, which is the 24th. That's right, the weekend of the 24th, I can't remember, 23rd, 24th, 25th, whichever one it is. Anyway, that's the hard deadline because that's the final at Lords. So we need to get it all wrapped up by then, and obviously need to find spacing grounds and things, and be able to organise all the logistics that go around this. That with the RHF, it's not like the old days of the county championship when people just drove a 10-hour drive in the morning and then drove back in the afternoon. You need to organise hotels, you need to organise proper grounds, and that's not necessarily going to be that easy. So it wouldn't be a huge surprise if they did have to, in fact, let's say those matches were shared points.
Okay, thanks, Sid. Now, something that I found interesting, actually, and something I don't think we knew was going to happen to Thunder, is that they've got Deandra Dottin back, haven't they? For the next, for this round today, and however many more rounds there are coming up of the RHF Trophy. So yeah, they've got her back. She's obviously made that decision to retire from international cricket. So I guess, at a bit of a loose end now that she left England after playing in the hundreds and went off to play in the Women's Caribbean Premier League and the 60, and has now come back and has rejoined the Thunder squad. She was obviously playing for them before the 100. And yeah, so interesting to see her back. Now, the rules of regional cricket do allow each side to field one overseas player. We haven't seen a huge amount of it though, and I think that's partly because of budget. The regions are still to some extent being run on a little bit of a shoestring. I think it's probably fair to say it's obviously a lot more of a professional setup than anything that we had before. So we have to kind of balance it all up and weigh it up, and we are making progress. Things are getting more professional, but the regions don't have huge budgets, and so it's just interesting to think about where that money might be coming from to fund Dottin's airfare back from the West Indies over to here. And obviously she's now going to be in England, we think, for the next few weeks, and going to be have to have accommodation and all of her travel paid for and everything like that. So it's a bit of a coup for the Thunder, I guess, getting her back over here, although she didn't have a great day with the bat today, but you win some, you lose some, or something. But yeah, it's an interesting move, isn't it, by the Thunder?
Yeah, they've obviously got a magic money tree up in Lancashire, so yeah, we'll be coming up and trying to find that and see if we can pick some of it as well.
Great, thank you for that, Sid. Shall we talk about England as well? So England obviously kicked off their series against India last night at Durham. We have to confess, if it wasn't obvious from Twitter, we weren't actually in Durham. We were meant to have been at home on Friday, and then we were obviously coming to Southampton today, and there's only so much travelling we can do before we drop down with exhaustion. But yeah, so England got off to a pretty convincing start actually in that first T20 match. They won by 9 wickets, and yeah, it was a good start to the series, Sid.
Yeah, it was a great batting performance, wasn't it? I mean, without Heather Knight and without Nat Siver, there's a little bit of concern about England's batting lineup. Not in terms of what they have the potential to do, but in terms of like that sort of that backbone and that ability to be able to sort of dig in when things go wrong. What we've essentially got is like from 1 down to sort of 9, you've got players that are explosive and can hit a long ball and can hit a lot of runs very quickly and can strike at 150 and 160. But you really need that to come off, for those players. And there's an awful lot of players in that lineup who sometimes it won't come off. But last night, they bazballed the hell out of it, and it really came off. They lost just 1 wicket. Captaincy was striking at 160 and ended up not out with 36. Is that right? And Sophia Dunkley, who had a little bit of a wobbly start. She was caught off a no ball in the first over, and she looked as if she'd completely forgotten how to bat. I mean, it's been a long time since the 100 final. It's been 7 days, but she really did look like it had been 6 or 7 months initially. I don't know what was troubling her, but once she got into her stride as well, she was striking the ball really nicely, and in the end a very positive performance for England. A bit of less of a positive performance for India, but they did put some decent runs on the board. I think that we've seen some suggestion from Indian fans that they were very disappointed with the team's performance, but Harmanpreet had something to say about the weather, didn't she? Because the weather, I think, does have a big impact. I mean, the Indians left, most of them left England after the Commonwealth Games, and they left in bright sunshine. We were in the middle of a heat wave. We'd had a little bit of rain around, but it was warm, and there were light evenings. And they've come back, and they're up in Durham, where it's kind of drizzly and horrible and cold. And Playing into September is, obviously an important part of the calendar these days, because they've had to play on into September to be able to squeeze in these extra series. But playing in the evenings in September, it doesn't look like much fun, does it, Raf?
Yeah, so this is what Harmanpreet said. I know it was not 100% conditions to play cricket, and still we were putting in effort. The ground was too wet. There were so many chances to get injured. And one of their bowlers did actually have to go off injured, didn't she, Radha Yadav? We haven't heard any update about that, but that meant that they were effectively a bowler down. So it was quite unfortunate, and interesting that kind of Harmanpreet Kaur is actually being relatively open about that in the press conference, and almost kind of complaining a bit and saying that India was sort sort of
Harmanpreet Kaur being assertive.
But she's saying effectively that India were forced into playing, and they didn't really want to play, which is an interesting one. Ultimately, it's down to the umpires whether play goes ahead and whether conditions are judged safe to go ahead. I suppose that often they would consult with the captains, perhaps, if it was a marginal decision. I mean, we weren't in Durham, so it's difficult for us to speculate, but certainly Harmanpreet Kaur seems to feel that India were a bit hard done by, and I agree with you that those conditions were difficult for India and would have been very unusual conditions for them to be playing in. They wouldn't have necessarily been able to adjust very quickly, but ultimately both sides had to field on that slippery outfield, and India came off much worse in the sense of putting in a really poor fielding performance, didn't they? And that cost them. So it's a tough one.
But how realistic do you think it is to carry on playing in September? I mean, it's very different. For example, right now, it's like 3:00 in the afternoon. We're in the innings break of the game. It's warm. It's t-shirt weather out. But in 4 or 5 hours' time, they started at 7:30 last night in the end, didn't they? And in 4 or 5 hours' time, it's going to be cold here. It might not be raining, but it will certainly, won't be particularly fun weather for playing cricket. And is it the kind of weather that the players are going to enjoy? Is that kind of developing the enthusiasm for cricket that we want? I'm just slightly concerned that particularly the evening games in September are a little bit of a bridge too far. What do you feel?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously we're partly subject to what's happening in the men's game, aren't we? Because there's a men's test happening at the moment, and therefore that means that when there's a men's test, the ECB don't want the women's games to start until 7 p.m. usually, because that's the time at which you can then do a men's test and then the women's international on the same channel, kind of back to back. So that's their preference. I mean, the men's international calendar has long stretched into September, hasn't it? I'm sure my dad would be able to tell me exactly when that happened. Hi, Dad. So that's obviously been an ongoing thing that's happened in the men's game. It's something relatively recent, actually, in terms of the women's game. It was last summer that we had the first international series taking place in September. It was England against New Zealand. And what's the thing that's changed? Well, it's the 100. The ECB have introduced the 100. The 100 swallows up the whole of August. So in the women's game, that means that the England players are unavailable for the whole of August to play international cricket, because the expectation is that the women's 100 has the best players playing in it. And we talked, I think, on last week's episode about that being a significant advantage for the women's 100. So therefore the ECB, that's not going to change. Okay, the England players are going to be expected to play in the 100 the whole of August. So previously we have had 2 teams coming to England in the summer. A couple of times we've had that, where we would have one team coming at the very start of the season, so maybe May, June, and then we would have had the second, the main event, the main international event would have been July, stretching into August. We can't have that now. So the ECB are trying to stretch out the women's international calendar by pushing it into September. Now, what happened last year? Well, the England players were all knackered by the end of it. There was some very poor batting against New Zealand, it was, I think, the only standout performance was that century from Tammy Beaumont on the very last day of the series, when everyone was just so relieved, like, oh, thanks for taking one for the team there, Tammy. The rest of us don't have to bat long now. Let's all go home and put our feet up because we're absolutely exhausted. Now, I may be projecting here, because certainly I found last season very tiring as a journalist, and I'm finding this season very tiring as a journalist. They go on. This season we've also had the Commonwealth Games, which was a huge event, very psychologically taxing, not to mention the physical toll that it takes on the players. And so it does become, this September series does then become just a case of like who can cope better with the exhaustion. Well, England not doing so well on that front, in terms of, we've had 2 frontline players, Catherine Brunt being rested, and Nat Siver actually saying 2 days before the series, I'm sorry, I can't cope with this. I mentally cannot cope with this. What was the phrase that she used? Emotional fatigue was the phrase that was in the press release. And who can blame her? It's a lot. So is the 100 going to change? No. Should the ECB be pushing for more international fixtures in September? I'm not sure they should, but Sky are not going to be massively happy about it, are they? Sky are a factor in this, aren't they, Sid?
Yeah, no, there's enormous pressure from television. I mean, and that doesn't help in terms of like getting the game on. I know officially the umpires are supposed to make a decision, based entirely on, the laws and the safety of the players. But I can tell you that for certain that there is pressure on the umpires to get the games on, and the umpires definitely, ultimately they're in charge, but they appreciate that there are commercial imperatives, and that the ECB make it really clear to the umpires that there are commercial imperatives underlying this. I just think it will be better overall if we accepted the fact that September evenings in particular are not great for this. Well, the Indians after Durham, they've got the second T20 coming up. That's going to be played somewhere balmy in the middle of a nice warm day, isn't it, Raf?
6 p.m. at Derby.
Oh, good luck, guys.
Looking forward to that one. Shall we talk a little bit about the captaincy, Sid? Because we have just mentioned the fact that Nat Siver dropped out of the series on Thursday morning, I think it was.
Yeah, it was right. They were already up in Durham and already training, and she'd obviously gone up there and realised that what she thought she could do, she couldn't do. And you have to respect that decision, right? Everybody has to respect it. This wasn't really something that she asked for. She didn't expect to be in this position. She was obviously the official vice captain, and she understood that her role was to take over if Heather Knight needed to leave the field for a comfort break or whatever, but she wasn't expecting to have to take over for an entire summer, and that's what's happened. And she's realised that plus the batting plus the bowling is just too much for her. And we did raise these issues, but at the end of the day the ECB were kind of struggling a little bit, or the management were struggling a little bit to find anybody else. In the end they've kind of opted for Amy Jones as sort of another kind of holding pattern captain. Amy Jones herself said on the television that she doesn't feel, I'm not really a natural captain, she said, in many ways that's not what you want to hear from your captain, but I appreciate her situation. Amy Jones to a certain extent now has taken it on as, okay, well, I'll do it, guys, even though I'm probably not the right person to ultimately be doing this. And
it's interesting that they've only made her captain for the T20 leg of the series. They've explicitly said that, so it's quite possible that we'll see somebody else taking it on for the ODIs. It really was very much a kind of last ditch, oh crap, who can we get to do this? Well, who's assured of their place in the starting 11? Well, Amy Jones is, and no disrespect to her, but she did do captaincy last season for the 100 for the Birmingham Phoenix, and this season the Phoenix got in Sophie Devine to do that role, presumably partly because Amy Jones said, look, I don't think that I'm massively cut out for this. As you said, she was on Sky last night saying, I'm a quiet person. We know she's a quiet person. The captain has to do press. It's not just about what happens on the field, it's all of this stuff around. You are going to be the one who's being
you're the figurehead, you're the spokesperson. You have, especially if the team lose, you're the one that has to go into the press conference and take the flak. That's tough.
It is tough, absolutely, and Nat Siver has already had a taste of that during the Commonwealth Games. She was the one that had to, despite the fact that Heather Knight was in the dressing room, kind of seemingly, from what we can gather, making a lot of the big strategic decisions. It was Nat Siver who was having to come up to the mix zone and do the press afterwards and be like, okay, well, this is what went wrong in the bronze medal match. Was clearly finding that really tough. Then we know that she was finding captaincy tough in the 100 because she actually took the decision to approach the Rockets coach Sally-Ann Briggs and Elise Villani and say, look, can you take on the captaincy, Elise Villani? I don't feel that I can give it justice at the moment. And really, honestly, that should have been when alarm bells rang in the England camp, and they should not have made her do this. I did tweet this at the time. I said, look, if she doesn't want to do it, and if she's going to bat like she batted in the eliminator when she's not captain, then don't give her the captaincy again. What did they do? They announced the squad and they gave her the captaincy again. And the timing of her decision to pull out of the series and pull out of the captaincy is interesting because obviously, presumably they had a conversation with her and they said, oh, we're going to make you captain. This is the squad. And she was like, presumably like, oh, okay. And then actually she realised that she couldn't do it. She couldn't do it to herself. Well, I'm afraid to me that seems like very poor management actually, to put somebody in that position of having to do that and then to put the rest of the team in the position of having to pick up the pieces as well. So yeah, not great. Good performance from England at the start of the series, but there are obviously some ongoing issues that need to be thought about and need to be thought about now before we get this same issue coming up again. think we'll wrap up there, Sid. Feels like we've done quite a lot of talking. Don't know if you heard that.
The umpires are walking back to the middle. We'd better get on with watching our game, Raf.
Bye for now.
Bye.